Hmm.
Okay, so we're recording, we're streaming, and we're muted still? No, so you're live. Let me take your card out of the way.
All right.
Pre-show card going away. All right, Walker.
All righty.
Welcome to Bird and Beckett. You want
Yes.
to give a talk tonight?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was the plan, in this midsummer's eve kind of setting on the West Coast. To explore and delve into a very interesting story. And what may be the most interesting about this story is, in the way of such primordial stories, is that the beholder, the auditor, the reader, the listener, the appreciator comes to understand it in such a way that it is nutrient to the soul. So what I'm talking about is a certain genre overarching other genres, and yet at the same time a para-genre, that is a genre alongside of the usual forms of literature and poetry, which is, after all, one and the same with the mind of beauty and compassion and its utterances, in all these different forms, in all these different genres. But then there's this other realm, you could say, or is it another realm, or is it another layer of the mandala of understanding? But this other realm is the realm of myth. And so what seems to loom before the mind at this moment is it has come to be time to appreciate the story of Cabeza de Vaca and his odyssey and his arduous trials and his revelations and his discoveries and his destiny and his fate, as well as those of his companions, who are no less important in their own way. Each of these are they're constellations. They're stars in a constellation that we have come to identify and see, and as myths, constellations also are myths. They are designs that become meaningful to us in terms of the associations that they evoke in us, in terms of the way that they provide nutriment for our soul. So, myth. It is in the realm of myth, Cabeza de Vaca and Estebanico and Dorantes and Castillo and so many others, 500 others, 500 others, some of whose names we know and some of whose names we do not know. But the myth gives us entryway into an appreciation of all of the living souls involved and the journey that they went on. And so, myth. So let me just say, normally the polarity is between the term logos and mythos. Logos being, and I'm going to use the terms sort of loosely in the way that I have cast them into my own imagination. So, as always, take it with a grain of salt. But I will submit to you that logos is the energy of meaning. The energy of meaning within the word. Whereas mythos is what is said. What is said. Now, we are constantly...
You know what?
Yes.
We got everything going and recording your talk, but
Yes.
we didn't actually have it streaming out. So,
Uh-oh.
ladies and gentlemen,
Oh, that's okay.
I don't believe that you were actually getting the stream until now. We're going to give you a minute to settle in while I check it from that end. But I think Walker will, having warmed himself up so his oratory is fully engaged, he will take it from the top in about 1 minute or less, and you are in for some fun.
All right,
Welcome to
yeah.
Bird and Beckett.
Okay, all right. Thanks,
Okay,
Eric.
yes,
Yes, all right. We,
Keep them entertained for a minute.
this is how we get the craft underway. And this is,
I got to take a look and see if Facebook
It's-
YouTube have it.
right, it's a parallel thing. As with all endeavors.
And looking at Facebook.
Because this, too, is an endeavor.
Yes, indeed. Everything is an adventure. Bird and Beckett.
With so many moving parts. But that's good. That gives me a chance actually to kind of rehash, so to speak, re-scramble, or just re-allow what was appearing before to appear now.
As it were.
As it were. Oh, yeah. And yeah, always we can throw in some of those things,
Extra little
Right. Now,
things for oomph.
right. I prefer, of course, the Homeric stratagems, the rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea. Right. Whereas, as it were, for me, is more when I'm, begging the audience's favor through some satirical aside. My version of the soft sell. Oh, my. Yes.
Okay, Walker
All right.
Brents, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead and reintroduce yourself
So-
and tell them what you're going to
All right. It's
tell 'em.
okay, indeed. So we are embarking underway on this voyage to have a new look at the story of Cabeza de Vaca and his strange odyssey of survival in the New World and the conditions that brought it into being. And so it seems then useful to sketch out just some preliminary generalized concepts, some general imaginative concepts to guide us, so to speak, along the way. And one of them would be the distinction we make between logos and mythos. The story of Cabeza de Vaca, as so many others, maybe countless others, has come to us again and again, which is part of the nature of its transmission through time, again and again in the form of a myth. And it is as a myth that I will be treating it this evening, a myth. It's the associations that we have with the word myth that deserve some degree of elucidation. I almost said hallucination, but that too is myth, which hopefully I'll be able to explain. There is on the one side mythos, we will call it, and then as the constellating polarity, we have the mythical or the imaginative conception of logos, the logos, mythos and logos. So logos, I would submit to you, is the energy of meaning. Logos is the inner energy, perhaps sometimes manifesting as form, which reaches consciousness, but it is that which provides us with a sense of meaning so that we can interpret the things that we see, have a basis for some kind of like code of understanding or a way to arrange analogies, likenesses, and similarities around this inner kernel, of what we would call meaning. Now, logos, that is logos. What is mythos in contradistinction to logos? Mythos is that which is said. And we could keep it that simple because its energy is that of what happens, the music of what happens, what is said about what happens, what is seen, what is manifested. This is mythos. But there's also this aspect of it, which is that it is told and retold, seen and then handed down and passed on across different cultures, across different generations, and down through the structures of time, where it takes form again as it finds its way to the lips of those who hear about it. This is mythos. As you can see, mythos and logos are, they're about as different from each other as anything in this world is different from anything else in this world. At the same time, they are as interdependent with each other as anything and everything else in this world is. So we will consider that just a little bit because Cabeza de Vaca and so many of our mythoses these days seem to be myths of meaning, because this is the mystery of myth. The mystery of myth, the mysto of mythos, is the different ways it constellates the logos. To put it somewhat playfully, but we have to approach it in this spirit. But Cabeza de Vaca's story, taking the form of a myth in so many ways, To begin with, let's look at our notion of individuality, of personality, of character. And let's distill them mythically. We can distill mythically character and personality and individuality for the purposes of myth making. It is inevitable that we distill them into presence. For mythos proceeds by the articulations of the happenings of presences. And the presences can be mythical presences, gods, demons, angels, archetypes, people. And the presences can also be things that fly under the radar of the way that we're used to looking at things. The unexpected, in other words. And now we're talking about the energy of the unexpected, the energy of surprise. These are the tropes of storytelling, of entertainment. In myth being what happens, you listen to it because you want to find out what happens. The question of what it means isn't necessarily put to you, not at first, because it's the energy of being alive in entrainment, in sync with the sequence of events as they are related in the mouth of the myth teller that creates this relationship of human consciousness by which myth lives in the world and continues to do so, regardless of how rational or irrational we believe ourselves to be. No need to go into that controversy. Rather, it is best to relate the myth simply as it is, simply as what happens. So, how would it begin to happen? Well, what I see in my mind right now, sing through me, O muses, as all of us, in one way or another, invoke inspiration before we proceed to relate that which we have seen, be it in the quote-unquote real world or our quote-unquote imagination. Anyway, what I see in my imagination is a mountain pass in Andalusia in early medieval times, in the 12th century, in a landscape where there are a great many cultures melding together, dry and arid landscape of stark pinnacles and rocky outcroppings of sort of like what? Gentle decorum and yet savage emotions, held in harmony with each other by these many, many excellent discrete codes of chivalry and aristocratic conduct and also aesthetic structures. For even at this time, of course, and long before, the real happenings in the human soul are related through the stories and the songs and the anecdotes and the pleasantries and the vernaculars and all the different verbal traditions, as well as the manners among the peasantry and the manners of the court and of all points in between, as well as the lore of the various workers and their various specializations in the various fields, the shepherds, the artisans, the iron workers, the caballeros, the horsemen, the planters, the pharmacists, so many others. Each has their own way of talking about what it is they see, what they must undertake as they go through their daily lives. Each creates its own style of language and its own logos and its own meanings. Anyway, so what I see then is a mountain pass, as an interpreter of the signs that the imagination gives. In the mountain pass, there is the skull of a cow, a bone, a fossil left by a ruminant animal. But this very thing, this cow's skull, literal and real, becomes a symbol, becomes a marker, becomes a sign, becomes a way of conveying meaning, because some sharp-eyed peasant on this mountain pass, which of course gives you a view of the countryside surrounding you, spied an approaching army, an enemy army. Perhaps it was a rival king. Perhaps there was, from across the sea, a foreign enemy. At any rate, that peasant saw the threat coming and was able to inform the local authorities and the protectors of the society of the approaching threat long before the approaching threat was able to be of real danger. So this became an acknowledged boon to the community. And so that sharp-eyed peasant, his descendants were given a noble title, which would allow them to, rather than be constrained by the hard scrabble necessities of eking out a living, at least they would still have to do this, of course, but now they would be a part of a different strata of the rapidly evolving and complexifying society, entry into like the nobility, with the name Cow Skull or Cabeza de Vaca. This is the origin of the strange name of the individual around whom this myth constellates. Alvar Nunez, Cabeza de Vaca. This was the royal family name given as a reward for the sighting of an approaching enemy, a fortunate sighting which was remembered by a cow skull in a mountain pass. So already we're talking about what? Symbolic happenings. I don't know. Anyway. Well, Cabeza de Vaca, we've talked about his symbolic name, his name of nobility. So let us continue then to think about this. Let's pursue this mythos thing a little bit more. And this idea of the fiction of presence. Mythos and the fiction of presence. Let's consider some of its sources and its roots, the vocabulary words from the New Testament, spoken or uttered or written in the Logos, in the Gospels, by St. Paul, when he spoke of principalities and powers. Now, what do we take when we hear such words as principalities and powers? What might that mean? It is uttered in the context of a warning or a way to fine-tune your own intuition. Be aware of principalities and powers, and know thou that the source of thy consciousness is one. This seems to be the message sometimes that St. Paul tries to convey to us. Principalities and powers, which, what are they? They are centers of influence. They are clusters of power, conceptual powers, principalities and powers. They are clusters of power. How does that manifest in the world of society, in the world of politics? Well, we're talking about principalities. The word prince comes from that. These centers of governmental administration, so let's just consider Spain at this time, or at the time immediately preceding the voyage of Narvaez, accompanied, by Cabeza de Vaca. This was a time when, at the foot of southern Spain, a ramshackle, disheveled gathering of principalities and administrative centers of various kinds began to coalesce into the next manifestation of some of these forms of governmental power. Principalities and powers, city-states, right? Other things, we speak of city-states in terms of Greece, but also in terms of Italy. All this is happening in various places, this evolution of political structures into complex aristocratic forms, coalescing into kingships and queenships, and coalescing further into, by way of consolidation, into empires. And then we're in a different realm of historical understanding. For it is in the nature of empires to extend their influence in all of these different and convoluted and spidery kind of ways. Empires feed on power. and seek more power along the lines that their power has become articulated to them. Lines of conquest, administrative influence, extension of dominion. And then you've got all these other kind of things happening. Once you have this kind of like spidery network of lines of energy, there come to be these individual things that are attracted, these individual currents, these individual trajectories, individual trajectories of fortune, soldiers of fortune, seekers, megalomaniacs, adventurers, escapers, but also those skilled in the real skills that they have learned with deep understanding, right? The navigators, the sail makers, the print makers, the artisans, and the builders. And of course, the artists and the scribes and the warriors as well. All these different layers of complexity seem to somehow connect to individuals and the lines of their own desire to grow, their own desire out of their own inner selves to come to a greater fruition of their own inner powers. And so they seek their destinies. They leave their homes and seek great things in the world. Is this a funny way to talk about, the explorative energy that began to emerge out of Seville in Spain and other places, and the openings into greater extensions of power that were given by these technological advances, metalworking, ironworking, sail making, navigation, as well as the imagination fired by vaguer and more nebulous concepts of distant El Dorados, or utopias, or riches, or fortunes to be made, or actual worlds to conquer. And so this allowed kind of an overflow from all of those who clustered around the courts of the kings and the queens at that time, and their complicated way of relating with each other and managing their own ambitions and calculations, and actual moral shortcomings and moral confusions. But it's the stuff out of which Shakespearean drama is made, is it not? And the stuff out of which worlds are discovered, and the stuff out of which exploitations and conquerings and atrocities and misunderstandings and human stories get further and further complexified, sometimes under dire circumstances. The age of exploration, Columbus, the discovery of America, all of this. Clashes of civilizations, hubris, misunderstanding, megalomania, ambition. Familiar stuff, eh? Well, so in this sheltered collection of islands in the turquoise Caribbean Sea, these various islands, archipelagos, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Cuba, these were the places that were the first footholds of the Spanish conquerors. We know this. Columbus's second voyage left behind some clever and ambitious individuals, in Hispaniola and later on Cuba. These were, what would I call them? They were soldiers of fortune. Velasquez, Narvaez, Cortez. Soldiers of fortune. And in a certain sense, they were kind of like came out of the military classes. Many of them. Many others came out of the kind of religious domains. Representatives of the crown were often chosen from the aristocratic domains and realms. This is how Cabeza de Vaca became sort of like what you could say in military terms, the second in command. He was actually kind of like the royal treasurer. one of his purposes was to make sure that the crown got what it wanted, its share of the riches to be uncovered by the soldiers of fortune who were making their way to the New World, or New Spain, as they called it. But of course, they also needed armor, soldiers, and weapons, and horses. And these boarded the ships at Seville and were taken down the Guadalquivir River and then across the Atlantic to these distant realms. But what these people were, okay, you could call them these personages that became the recipients of this divine largesse, because of their own ways of intrigue in the court, their ability to outfit themselves with not only ships but weapons, and then this insight into the way that power can be extended and had and gained in this new world, fired by the beckonings of glittering gold and riches beyond imaginings even of the kings and the queens that sponsor them. Ripe fruit for megalomania. And geez, when has it not been this way? Well, away they went to the New World, and we're still dealing with the consequences of it morally in our understanding, are we not? And it's easy to just get swallowed up in the perplexities of that, to which, though, is offered this mythical vision of just, here is a way that we can imagine how it is that it happened. Okay, let's look at it this way. Let's just jump to Cuba in about 1515 and 1530, just loosely. And what you've got is Velázquez, and in so many ways, these were like the celebrity billionaires. I mean, if the story were told now, I don't even want to think about it, I'm sure, what kind of celebrity would they be? They would just be all the excess and the cunning and the calculation. But we don't even have to do that. That's not our myth. Instead, our myth is that which I am relating to you now. So, Hernan Cortez, he sees Velázquez. He sees what Velázquez has. Hernan Cortez decides, I'm going to be his avant-garde. I am his advance guard. I have the military skills. I have his ear. I have influence in the centers of power and riches. I have a plan. I have an idea. I have something that possesses my mind. There is something out there that will make us all rich. Allow me to make the initial foray and undertake the risk. Risk takers they are. To go to this place across this gulf and see what is there. And he doesn't exactly wait, to put it in very general terms, for any kind of permission. There's all kinds of ways and complexities, the way that power is shared and influence is had. But, sometimes, and this is how it is, what do they call it? Sometimes they call it initiative, But whatever you want to call it, Hernan Cortez took it. And he was the one who went across the Gulf to Yucatan and found rumors of gold, and began to form these different alliances and to form these different plans and to amass his power and to make settlements as well, colonizations, the establishments of these civilizations. At the same time, Narvaez, kind of another protege of Velázquez, who's been in Cuba also, but he's over in Spain now, Pamphilio Narvaez. And he has attached himself, as they do, to the court of Spain, King Ferdinand. King Ferdinand dies, though, sometime around 1516. And then there's a little bit of a wobbliness in the succession, as much as they had been for the last 75 or so, or 50 years. consolidating themselves into an empire out of a ramshackle collection of principalities. There was still a lot that they had to learn about administration and governance, and so there was a lot of chaos. And whenever there is that kind of chaos, there's a certain kind of form of opportunism, which tends to get more and more complex as it finds its way forward. Anyway, Narvaez is attached himself to the court. Eventually, two things happen of note to some degree. King Charles, the grandson of Ferdinand, is chosen to be the one who will be the monarch of Spain. But also, Bartolomeo de las Casas, also one who traveled as a protege of Velázquez, an administrator, a representative of the crown. Ostensibly, at first, his duty was, like Cabeza de Vaca's would be later, was just to make sure that the crown got its share of the riches and the plunder that was there. But also, though, an astute moral observer. Here's where we're talking about myth now, because this too, even though it's a logos of a kind, because the meaning of it is the growth of the mythic consciousness. And we have to have that as a theme as we approach all of this. The growth of the moral consciousness, certainly also the growth of the mythical consciousness. But I'm talking about the growth of the moral consciousness, which, what a burden it must have been for Bartolomeo de las Casas to see the atrocities that he saw in Cuba and other places in the West Indies. So much so that he voyaged back to Spain and he began to speak out in the ways that were available to him as a member of that society. He also entered holy orders, became a Dominican priest, which he was not at the time when he was in New Spain. I think he only became a Dominican later on. But I'm not sure how many times he went back and forth either after that. But at any rate, while Narvaez was there, Bartolomé de las Casas was beginning to say, hey, people, there's something going on over there that we need to look at if we are growing as human beings in the understanding of moral rule and moral law, studying our holy logos, our holy scripts, turning the pages to see the articulations of the energy of meaning. For Bartolomeo de las Casas, it was reading in, I can't remember, it was the 34th book of Ecclesiastes, some text, some logos, where it was related that it was not a good thing to deprive people of their livelihood, that it was not a good thing to steal bread from the poor, that it was not a good thing to make it harder for other people to live. And yet Bartolomeo was remembering everything that he had seen in the New World, even under the auspices of the rationalizations of the powers and the principalities extending their influence. It was resulting in actual human suffering on the ground. This simple thing evidently was hard to express and hard to make plain to people. And so it became the work of Bartolomeo de las Casas to articulate this troubling news. And Narvaez, he heard about this too. For Narvaez, who was seeking influence in the court for the entrepreneurs in New Spain, who was bringing gifts of gold as gifts to King Ferdinand and then later on to King Carlos. He was seeking influence on behalf of his mentor in Cuba. He was looking to undertake his own expedition because he knew of this mythical land to the north where there could be even more gold, but whatever it would be, if he could only just gather up an armada to go and explore it, it would be his. And so it is on record that he spoke very disparagingly of Bartolomeo de las Casas, speaking of him as an irresponsible man, even for bringing up these moral questions about harm being done to the human souls who already were there. Well, while he was at court, it was a very frustrating time for him. These were men of action, right? He wanted to get back there and he wanted to get his thing going. Well, meanwhile, Cortez, he had jumped the gun. He went to the Yucatan Peninsula. He established relations of his own with some of the native peoples there. He heard of a land, Tenochtitlan, inland, in a plateau on an inland lake. guarded by drawbridges full of gold. And the rest is history. But this fired the envy of Narvaez, and he wanted to have his own. Like so many of them, they were motivated by this new world where they could take what they had learned in the courts of Europe, learning about powers and navigation and armor, weapons and soldiering, and then to have an actual place where they could go and use these skills to become as kings themselves, to become as mighty as gods. Yes. And when they heard about this, yes, it fired up the megalomaniacal urge to go to these places, and everything became subservient to that morally. Well, these are all things, these are just ways for all of us to further our own exploration of these pages of history. At any rate, it's time to tell you what happened then. Eventually, Narvaez got his wish. Poor fellow. Oh, but not before having been dispatched by Velázquez to rein in Cortés, because Cortés had jumped the gun. He had jumped ahead and taken power without having the express, gone through the express processes of the court. He had interpreted the transactions of power to his own advantage. And things had gotten a little out of hand. The perennial problem of political science. At any rate, Narvaez was sent to do something about this with an even larger army. But he arrived in Yucatan. Cortés had already established himself there. Cortés, he must have been one gifted in the ability to win friends and influence people. He was able to bring over many of Narvaez's men to his side. And there eventually, as things happen with these, gentlemen of honor, things came to blows and there was violence. And to such a degree that Cortés was victor, but Narvaez was imprisoned. One Spaniard conquistador imprisoning another one. He was imprisoned for 4 years. He had already lost his right eye in the battle against the forces of Cortés. So many other things were going on, of course. Eventually, he was deemed harmless and he was released. And back he went to Spain, having heard about a land to the north, Florida. Heard about it from Ponce de Leon, who was exploring for certain reasons that were ostensibly less to establish settlements and things. And so he was able to move more quickly and penetrate farther into the territory. But what he learned fired the intentions of Narvaez, and Narvaez was able then to outfit, 5 ships, 500 people, all kinds of people. As always, now it's time to mention that too. It wasn't just military people. It wasn't just conquistadors who were going over there. Those ships were full of all kinds of people. Because, as always, in any kind of immigration, to really understand it, you've got to pay more attention to what is impelling the movement than to what is beckoning the movement. Sure, there is unlimited possibilities and all that, but that was probably mainly firing the imaginations of those who knew that they stood to profit by it. But as for the people who populated the ships, they were probably, so many reasons why, because there was so much of an economic kind of impulsion on them. There's no need to go into all the details of that. It would be a different myth were I to do that. But at any rate, there were these soldiers of horsemen, caballeros, hidalgos, soldiers of fortune. But there were also representatives of the crown, people from distinguished families like Cabeza de Vaca and like Dorantes and Castillo. And they had certain functions that were connected to their aristocratic standing in the society. But there weren't as many of them as you think. But they were there with their own kind of way of seeing things, but the primary energy, as we've come to understand the myth, of course, is the energy of soldiers of fortune. And anyway, so away they went across the Atlantic. And there was problems with navigation. It was always a big question to find a good navigator, or a pilot, as they called them. Columbus, and all the others Originally, it was the simple. I say simple, not meaning it's not difficult and chancy as everything, but they called it dead reckoning. Point to destination in distance covered and speed. And so the navigators of this time learned how to gauge their speed by the way the rate that they passed the bubbles floating on the surface of the ocean, and to keep their destination in mind and the point from which they'd left. And then there came these other kinds of maps which drew these straight compass lines, and they were able to see those and take advantage of those. But the reason that I'm talking about this is because a great many of the pilots were actually not literate. And so when we speak of longitudes and latitudes, there was a degree where that knowledge was not available to many. And even when it was available, it was of such a kind of like a theoretical nature that it wasn't actually useful to the people who were using it, who had learned more how to do navigation by dead reckoning. And then they learned how to read these compass lines on maps and everything. And of course, it was very, very important. Well, here's the thing for Narvaez and the others. The Gulf of Mexico, there's that Gulf Stream. And when that's there, they were just coming to understand that. Ponce de Leon wrote that even with a favorable wind, we were still moving opposite from the direction we thought we were going. Well, this was because of the Gulf Stream. They still didn't quite fully understand that and chart that until like maybe 100 years later. And so Narvaez, one-eyed and overconfident and megalomaniacal, and having called in all his debts and basing his entire fortune, after having been imprisoned by his arch-rival Cortez, was now bent on exploring this area from the Rio de las Palmas, near what is now presently Tampico, north to the peninsula of Florida, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that would all be his, if only he could get there and claim it. And he needed to get there before Cortez got any ideas. He was rapidly consolidating his power, further south. So these people, reckless people, they were where they were because their risky undertakings had brought them to that point. So therefore, they were bent on compelled to continue to take the risks that had brought them success before, until they would run aground. This is how it is sometimes with this kind of like energy in the human spirit, which was providing so much of the impetus for the things that were happening back then. Anyway, well, Narvaez, by the time he got to Cuba, they had gone through another thing, hurricanes. They didn't know about hurricanes in Spain. But here they were in the Caribbean, and this stuff was happening in the weather, which was incredibly destructive and caused a lot of ships to be destroyed and people to be lost. So from the start, for Narvaez, this was happening. He was losing ships and people and horses to hurricanes. And he hadn't even had a pilot yet to get him to Florida, to get him to Panuco, which was where the Rio de las Palmas empties into the Gulf. That was where he was to establish his kingdom and then go north and west and east. But he needed to get there, and he needed a good pilot, and he wasn't able to get one. I don't want to say the name nor cast blame necessarily. It's not that kind of mythos, though it could be said that, and this happens in the myths of lost expeditions. You hear about it again and again. You hear about it with the Donner Party, with a lot of other kind of parties where they get misguided. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, there was this idea that the pilot that they hired, whose experience was rather nebulous, he may have accompanied Ponce de Leon, but we don't know that. But this particular pilot was saying, oh yeah, you can't miss it. It's a big bay, it's a big harbor. Yeah, I know the way there. Hire me, and I will take you there. Well, but that's not what happened. What happened was they got into the Gulf and they met up with the Gulf Stream in a certain sense, and they were being blown east and north when they thought that they were going due west. And they had no idea. So that by the time they came to the coast, the west coast of what is now Florida, they thought that they were in Panuco or close to it. And so they thought, all we need to do now, the coastline looks a little weird, but, you can never tell what a coastline looks like when you first look at it. But eventually we'll come to it, right? And the pilots, oh, yeah, well, let's just stay on the coast here up and down for a while. But, and they did. And they didn't find it. And so Narvaez decided to go ashore with some 300 people. And they left 100 people on the ship. They had already lost close to 100, the better part of 100 in those hurricanes that I mentioned. So things were beginning to kind of look dire. But these people who held influence for this party were risk takers. And for them, fortune was for the intrepid. And so they were going to do that. And they were going to take the gamble and take the risk. And so, which led Narvaez to divide his forces to say, I with what horses that survive, and that was like half of the horses they had. I think it was maybe 40 horses they had, 300 soldiers, 100 people will stay on the ships, and we're going to go inland, and we're going to see what we find. Oh, we've been in contact with some of the natives here, and they say that there is a rich place called Appalachia. We're going to go there and see about this. You can already tell, this is where their priorities are. Whereas you on the ships, you stay here on the coast and we will rendezvous. The bay is here, clearly. So just keep going in that direction and you'll come to it and we'll meet up with you there. And there were those who did not think that this was a good idea, among them Cabeza de Vaca. But like conquistador gentlemen of the time, Narvaez said, well, I'm going to do this with my forces here, and if you are afraid, you can stay with the ships. And Cabeza de Vaca, he too was a Spanish gentleman, and he said, me, afraid? And for his honor, he did not accompany the ships. He stayed with the party that went inland. He said so himself when he wrote about it later. I don't know if he regretted his decision or not, but at any rate, from this point, the writing was on the wall for this expedition. They went into the swamps of Florida with their horses and their crossbows and their heavy armor. And they didn't have that many provisions left on the ship. They took the lion's share of the provisions, the salt, pork, and the hardtack, which of course wasn't that good. And they would soon run out of it. And by the time they did, they were in the swamps with their horses and their crossbows and their armor sinking, every step they took, neck deep in the mud at times. And at times subject to ambush from arrows that were sent from these huge bows with such force that they could penetrate the trunk of 2 oak trees, the thickness of a man's leg simultaneously, and come out the other side. And so they lost a lot of their number that way. A great many drowned, of course, also in the muck and the mud and the swamps. And they were starting to get hungry, of course, and so they would come to various settlements of the Native Americans there. And they would establish contact and raid what stores they had at times. Other times they would bargain, with the things that they had brought with them, beads and things like that, in return for food, venison, things like that. We don't have time to go into the details of all the native settlements that they came to. But let it be said that the overriding idea in Narvaez's mind was to continue north all the way up, to where the Gulf, where the peninsula of Florida, turns toward the west, to find this fabled city of gold, Appalachia, which they didn't find it in the way that they thought that they would find it, of course. Instead, they came to various places where they were sometimes treated well and sometimes were not treated well, and they themselves, of course, having superior weapons, they usually did not treat people well, and for which they were retaliated against. These arrows were far more formidable than they thought. In this terrain, their crossbows and their horses were far less formidable than they thought that they would be. Didn't serve them as well as it did Pizarro further south, nor Cortez. And pretty soon they were in dire straits. And so eventually it came to a point where they realized that they had to abandon this overland quest and instead take to the sea while they were still near to the sea, and they knew that they were, and then go by water and try to get to Panuco that way, because by now they'd realized this was not even the same coastline. And so it's unbelievable to imagine what it must have been like for them to melt their weapons, their spurs, their armor, their crossbows, their saddles, all the accoutrements of knighthood, to make what? To make tools in order to build rafts, in order to escape. This was a land, as Cabeza de Vaca wrote, that was such a strange land, impossible to live in, and yet impossible to leave. And yet here they were. Then they began to melt down the accoutrements of their self-conceptions as warriors, as people of valor and weaponry. And at the same time, though, there were some among them shipbuilders and things who were skilled and were able to improvise the machines, the instruments that they would need to have to accomplish what they were really beginning to realize what they needed to do. They were able to fashion pipes to carry, hot air by hollowing out logs. They were even able to make a bellows out of deer skin. And so in that way, they were able to melt down their nails and their armor and to make axes and to make other kinds of tools to chop down trees to build rafts. They couldn't build ships, but they could build rafts. And of course, not all of them were seagoing people. Only the people who manned the ships were the seagoing people, and they were already out on the Gulf, and they were not going to see them again. Oh, those people, by the way, they stayed there for about a year waiting for them to reemerge from the wilderness, which they did not. And so then they went back to Cuba. So they lived, that 100, those sailors. But the overland party, things were different for them. They were able, though, to melt their weapons down. They even had, horror of horrors, to eat their horses, because it was that or starve. They were afflicted not only by the arrows of the people there, but they were also afflicted by disease. It could have been malaria, it could have been typhus, it could have been typhoid, it could have been dysentery, it could be any number of those things, but their numbers were rapidly decreasing all the time. By the time, though, they were able to make these rafts they had the conifers, the cypresses and the pines and the spruces, and they were able to braid from their horses that they ate. They were able to braid ropes of horsehair. They were able to take palmetto, this is Florida after all, palmetto fibers, and to melt the pitch sap, the sap of certain of the pine trees, to make oakum to caulk the spaces between the logs of the rafts that they built. And so they made 5 rafts, each one capable of carrying 50 men. And they didn't have clay. The natives had clay, as containers for the water, which they would need. But for some reason, they didn't fashion that. They were able to fashion a bellows and these other things, but they couldn't make clay. Instead, though, they took the hide from the legs of the horses and fashioned water containers out of the leather of the hides, so that they would have fresh water as they boarded their rafts on this. None of them with any real knowledge of navigation, but in such dire straits that this was, by now, it was forget about the gold and forget about the conquest. Now it's just survive. Their very notion of their identity was being shed like a skin. So these had maybe this much clearance from the water when they were fully loaded down, and not much room to move. Of course, the passage over the Atlantic was not that dissimilar, but this, of course, is much more arduous. Anyway, into these rafts they went, and then they went close to the coast, and they sailed. They made sails out of their shirts, masts out of the timber that was available, and there was plenty of timber available, Anyway, they were able to, for 750 miles, right along the coast, and they encountered Sometimes they had to go ashore to eat and also to find water, but they encountered hostile encounters with the people that were there. And sometimes they were able to trade for food, and then they would continue on their way, and always so much uncertainty. And they came to where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. They were the first Europeans to see the Mississippi River. They were so grateful to be able to just drink the fresh water, because there was such a force of water that came from the Mississippi out into the Gulf that the water all around, was fresh, even though technically it was the ocean. And they were so glad for that. But at the same time, the force of the water was sending the rafts far, far, farther from land than they wanted to be. So that very often they lost sight of each other, these 5 rafts. Lots of situations for them, dire ones. People dying from thirst, people driven to such extremity that they would drink the salt water. And of course, the sodium bonds with what water molecules are there, and so people can die suddenly from this. But they were sometimes in such dire straits that many of the number did that and perished, as well as the disease and the starvation. This was several months. So by the time it was November, there were very few of the rafts had sight of each other. Narvaez and all his one-eyed overconfidence, eventually, because he had the strongest men on his raft, he was able to make for shore at a certain time where all the others would, they knew that they had to make for shore or they would starve, but the conditions were questionable, and they had to row and row and row. And because he had the strongest ones on board with him, he was able to get to the shore. The others actually found waves miles further along that cast them upon the beach also. Actually, they all kind of ran aground. They came ashore, their rafts in various states of disrepair. Perhaps at Galveston, perhaps at other island just south of Galveston. And dying many all along the way. Narvaez, at this place, he insisted, along with some of his assistants and his inner circle, so to speak, on sleeping on the barge or on the raft, while the others slept on the beach, because they feared attack from the people who lived farther inland. But it wasn't that caused Narvaez and his life to be lost. It was a wave came while they were sleeping, and the raft drifted out to the open ocean, and Narvaez and the others with him were never seen again. And the others, they had to stay on this beach then. And then some of the other rafts came ashore not all that far away, though they didn't have contact with each other for many days. And this was November. The winter was especially harsh that year, something like 1526 or something like that. And, eventually, Cabeza de Vaca, and some of the others, they tried to put their raft together again and set out to sea again, but a great wave came and engulfed it, and they had put all their clothes and everything on the raft so they could push the raft out to sea. But when the wave came and broke it apart, they were lucky to be alive. A few of their number died and drowned, but the rest of them were cast ashore onto the sea, utterly naked and destitute of anything. They had been in contact, though, with some of the Native Americans further inland a little ways, and they had been trading venison and fish, and the root probably of the cattail, and learning how to live off the land, and actually establishing kind of a concord. They would bring some of their women and children down to see these strangers, But they came down one evening and they found Cabeza de Vaca and the others naked and soaked and shivering and cold and wailing in despair. And these Native Americans, when they realized what had happened, that their raft had broken apart, they'd lost some of their number and their hope of leaving was forever gone, they sat down with them and lamented as well. Cabeza de Vaca writes of it. And so for a while, they all on the shore lamented together And eventually, Cabeza de Vaca asked, "Can we come and stay with you?" And the Native Americans said, "Yes, we will be back this evening." Some of the others were very, very frightened because they had heard about stories of human sacrifice and cannibalism. And they thought, no, let us not go with them, let us not go with them. But Cabeza de Vaca said, "Here we are exposed to the elements with nothing. We've established relations with them already. We have to take our chances. Now we have no choice." But here is what they did. They were either the Capoque people or the Han people. And this is another aspect of the story. We don't really know specifically a lot of the native people that they came in contact with, because in the next 100 or so years, even sooner for many of them, these peoples did not exist anymore or were assimilated into other groups. Let me just say, it's a known fact, and I think our psyches, though, are starting to get used to it, this idea that actually up until 1450 or so, the population of America and Europe were about equal. I mean, there was a lot of native peoples here in the New World. And it wasn't, of course, just the violence that caused the populations to decimate. It was a lot of other factors as well. Of course, it was also the disease and all of this. These were cultures, peoples that had been separated for, I don't know how many thousands of years, right, after coming down from the Bering Strait, and then the people in Europe. And then they met again after all these thousands of years. And, well, it's a world of complexity, is it not? Anyway, these native peoples, they did come back in the evening, and they gathered up the shivering survivors. They made a big bonfire on the shore so that they could warm themselves, because it was very, very cold, and they were in danger of perishing from the cold. But these Native Americans had also set up bonfires all along the route to their village. And so they would warm the castaways by the fire, and then they would help them up and spirit them further down the trail to the next bonfire, making sure that they didn't have very much time in between these bonfires so that they wouldn't die of the cold. And in this way, they brought them to their own village, where they shared their meager food with them. These were hunter-gatherers. These were nomads. They were only there on this island, Galveston or that other island south of there, in order to gather the cattail roots. And they would only be there for the winter. And then they would go, and then it was blueberries that they would live on, blackberries that they would live on for the next few months. And then it would be these other kinds of food, cactuses. They were nomadic in this way. And eventually, though, like I say, by this time there were 80. By the time spring came, there were 15 of the party of Narvaez. And there were various reasons that they perished. And also by this time, too, this was the way it was. No longer were they, eventually they were not guests anymore, but they became slaves. Not in the sense of like economic organized slavery, but this was the nature of these nomadic bands, where they would take in people from other places, and they would be hospitable and everything. But eventually, of course, conditions were such that if you're not going to pull your weight here and help us out in this way, what are you doing here? And so we need this, dig, gather this. And so eventually this is how they survived. These were the conquistadors. These were the Spanish noblemen. These were warriors. These were skilled craftsmen. These were entrepreneurs. These were colonists. These were missionaries. But now they're carrying sticks. Now they're being cuffed upside the head. And yet at the same time, they are surviving. And they are living with the people, eating what these people eat, living the same lives that the people do. Very, very different. Isn't that a very different mythos? But this is part of our mythos also. This is what happened. This was the way it was. But they were able to contact with each other sometimes, because some of the bands intermingled, because they shared common food sources. Be they, the oyster beds, the blackberries in the dunes, the swamps where the cattails were, and all these places. The bands would kind of intermingle there, and so sometimes they're able to make contact with each other. Eventually, there was just the three that we speak of, the four that we speak of. Actually, there was five first, and then there are individual stories that are full of pathos. Certain individuals you come to know in the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca, at least in your imagination, in the fiction of presence, and then you don't see them anymore. And it is the nature of Cabeza de Vaca's writing to, several times he says, our conditions were so extreme that one can easily imagine the things that I will no longer relate to you. He would say this kind of thing. But then he would kind of put it in these other ways. Anyway, eventually they knew they were able to contact with each other sometimes. Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes and Estebanico and Castillo. Interestingly enough, Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes and Castillo, these were the people from drawn as representatives of the crown, but they were nobles. I wonder what we can make of that. Because it is true, and we can see it clearly, as we will come to understand it, if I can relate it to you. It seemed that for them, their identity was less entangled in the whole warrior thing and the conquering thing and the gold finding thing and the rich megalomania, because their understanding of life was just kind of a little bit different. And they began to be able to see that they were living with other human beings. They began to realize that they had left behind all of the accoutrements that made them think that they were one way, but now the way that they were living, they realized that they were another way. I have to mention that, of course, there was Estebanico. He was from Morocco. He was caught in his early youth by a slave raiding party from Portugal. He was sold in Seville as a slave. He was bought by Dorantes, a nobleman. He was more of a man of action, so to speak, among them. And yet, here he was, a slave. And now his slavers were themselves enslaved. And, well, this is mythical. It is impossible to imagine the bond that they had. I'm trying to think of the contemporary author, Leila Leilami. Does she write for The Nation sometimes? She wrote a novel about Estebanico, the Moor. Well, these are all points of departure for us to think about. And of course, I may or may not have some of the names right. But at any rate, these were the survivors. And they would meet together sometimes as they were rooting and carrying sticks and digging for pecans. And at some point, it came about that one evening they were in their rude huts and they were eating, and they sort of learned how to communicate with each other. Eventually, these four castaways learned, they say, 6 of the native languages of all the various peoples that they lived through. But early on, there on Galveston, in a cold winter evening, the conversation came up. Somehow they were talking about life or something, and their hosts were saying to them, stones have life, rocks have life, plants have life, animals have life, the earth has life. Some of our number are sick. Lay your hands upon them and make them better. And Castillo's father was a university teacher at Salamanca. And perhaps he was the more refined. He was also kind of more low-key. And he was the one actually, at first, they all talked about it. Let me just mention this. I like to read the Spanish mystics, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. I like to read them because I feel like in my imagination I can understand the world that they are describing and their experiences in that world. If I am ever put off by what may be sentimental piety or harshness of the language, I imagine in my mind the places where they lived and the places where they prayed and meditated and the beauty of the natural world that they responded to. And then I go back to what they wrote, and I can begin to take into account the way that they are using some of their pious terms. And so that the things that they write makes sense to me. That's one thing we got to remember, because Spain at that time also as a land, there was visionary elements in the culture and in the perception of the people. Saint Teresa and her visions. Saint John of the Cross and his beautiful poetic visions. Various, what were they there? Illuminati, Bruzado, some kind of like Spanish Illuminati. Just these various kind of mystical, fervent kind of currents that would seize the populace. But there was just this understanding of a whole different reality, this different level of reality, mythos impinging upon their daily life. I saw the heavens open up. This is what happened. Do not ask me about the meaning of it or the logos of it, because I saw what I saw. You know what I mean? Today we call it phenomenology. But back then it was something different. So the Native Americans said, lay your hands upon our sick. After all, how do we know it is not you who made them sick? Because they were bringing their typhoid and their malaria and their dysentery. And the people that were there had less of a defense against it. And so they were dying as much as the Spaniards were. Eventually, the person who owned Cabeza de Vaca said, because it's interesting, later on the idea became that there was like cannibalism practiced by the natives, and there probably maybe was ritual kind of cannibalisms, but what really happened was there was cannibalism practiced by these Spanish castaways, and on those beaches in Galveston, and Cabeza de Vaca relates it. This was the dire extent that many of the scattered parties, isolated from each other in these harsh elements, there was that happened. And that's often what can be sometimes. And when the Native Americans heard about it, having discovered bodies that had indications that cannibalism had occurred, they came back to these Spaniards and they said, you people are sick. Well, they didn't put it that way, but, they began to just they wanted to do away with them because they could not stomach it, as well as their own people being sick. They had worn out their welcome at that time. The person who took care of Cabeza de Vaca said, let us not kill them. They are not sorcerers. Their own die just as we do. So it couldn't be that. If they were this, then they would be able to save themselves, and they are not able to save themselves. So that is not the question. They are not evil in that way, so let them live. And the word of that individual is what allowed Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban and Castillo and Dorantes to live. Some of the others did not live for this reason. Anyway, but they said at the same time, come lay your hands upon them. Stones have power. Hands have power. Heal them. And so Cabeza de Vaca and the others, they would talk together. Like I say, they came from a land of mystics and visionaries. There was a certain way where that was something that was not as altogether as offensive to them as it might be to us, because our rationality is more attenuated now than it was back then for them. But they also said, there's also the presence of what no one expects, the Inquisition. They came from a land where there was, on the one hand, visionaries, on the other hand, extreme puritanical piety, justification for all these atrocities coming from the cathedrals. And at the same time, there was the Inquisition. No one expects the Inquisition. But here they were in this other land, completely divested of everything that was part and parcel of the way they used to perceive reality. And now they were being asked to lay hands upon their hosts to heal them. Surely there's something that is just not proper about this. And so they refused. They said, no, we can't heal people. And then the people said, okay, then you don't eat. And they wanted to eat. They needed to eat. So they went and they laid hands on some of these people. And the people got better. Now, how could you explain this? But Cabeza de Vaca relates it. It started then. Castillo, he seemed to be the one that they kind of gravitated to most as the one who could do that. And yet at the same time, he was the one who was kind of more diffident about it. And they would discuss, is this right, what we're doing? Because they knew these four had been through so much. And they all knew that they were all sinners. I mean, the things that they had done to survive already. And so they would ask themselves, who are we to be doing this? We are sinners ourselves. But then it worked. And so what could they say? They took it as everything about this is we are only alive because of God's favor. Perhaps he is working through us in some way. And so, so this happened, and then this happened, and it continued to happen in other contexts. Eventually now, these were mostly nomadic people that they actually assimilated among. The people, the Appalachia kind of stuff, these were actually remnants. There used to be all up and down the Mississippi, these huge cities of thousands of people based on corn and maize and agriculture and the Mississippi River, centralized structures, complicated hierarchies. And they actually, for one reason or another, they began to collapse and change, even before the Europeans came. But Appalachia and stuff, that was still some kind of remnant of that kind of culture. But now the culture that they were much more nomadic hunter-gatherers. They went where the food sources were. Because of this, there was a lot of interchange between the groups and complicated trade routes, and all kinds of things were traded. Eventually, Cabeza de Vaca and the others, they were able to sometimes escape from their captors and go among other bands, and then they would escape from those other bands, and they were able to do this because, well, it's inscrutable to us, really. It wasn't like when I say slaves, it wasn't like organized economic slavery. It was more like of a looser kind of thing. And of course, bad things could happen, and yet at the same time, they were able to sometimes move and be in different places. More often, it was necessity about food sources and the elements and stuff that dictated among which groups that they would be living. And so, anyway, they eventually came to the valley of the Guadalupe River, where there were these immense tracts of pecan trees. And groups from many, many different places, miles and miles away, would come and eat these pecans. And we can well imagine Estabanico and Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes and Castillo meeting together, their spidery fingers grubbing for pecans and cracking them open and eating them and hatching their plans about what they intended to do and how they could continue to. They still wanted to reach Panuco. And so eventually Cabeza de Vaca escaped from his captors and found himself, he went inland, and his services began to be appreciated as someone who could intermediate between these tribes as a trader, because he belonged to no one particular tribe. And he knew what was available at the coast, the seashells. The edges of some of the seashells were ceremonially used to cut open these certain kinds of mesquite beans for religious ceremonies. And also he could bring in he called them sea beads. They were probably pearls of one kind or another, but also mollusks and the various usages of mollusk shells. Bring them inland several, 90 miles or so, and then come back out with animal hides and ochre and deer skins and other things like this. And so he became a certain kind of itinerant trader. But he could not have done this totally by himself. This was along these trade routes, these sophisticated trade routes, which he experienced by living the same life. It's just that in and of itself is mythical. And yet, anyway, eventually, though, this idea was to keep on going west and to find the way to Panuco. It has to be here somewhere. And so eventually they all met up with each other and they traveled together and they lived among all these different peoples. And again and again and again, they would come to these places, especially as they began to make their way farther west. Who knows the way that news is passed? They would travel together. Two of them could swim. Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes could swim, but Estabanico and Castillo could not swim. I only say that because there were just all these ways that they were interdependent with each other. We cannot imagine. And all the different kind of societies that they were living, the different environments that they were eating, and the way that they had to, amidst such uncertainty, the way they must have learned how to trust each other. And it's a whole different understanding of destiny or fortune, you might say. They came from a place where the thing to be was a soldier of fortune. And yet here they were, living and surviving in these most extreme and strange and indescribable circumstances, through sheer coincidences and sheer chance and strange manifestations of their own power to give life that they could hardly understand. Cabeza de Vaca wrote about it later on. This is another reason why it's a mythical kind of presence, because it's the utterances of a presence who would say the things that he would say. Again and again, he says in so many words, I leave it to your imagination. I will not say what it was we went through, but I leave it to your imagination. And then at other times it would be like, everything that we had been, we left behind. We were something else. And the tissue of everything that you know yourself to be is suddenly gone in the energy that comes from you to bring health to someone who is sick. And that became part of the way that they regulated their own kind of thoughts and consciousnesses. I'm sure it was a way to survive, but can you imagine a survival skill where they would just kind of pray and purify and gather their energies and understand the pure chance and the impossibility of ascribing anything that was happening to their own merit in any way, because they knew that they all knew amongst each other that they were not angels or saints or anything like that. And yet, here it was. And then as they began to move more and more toward the west, word of them preceded them. And very strange to think. But here it was, after several years, they continued to make their way west, and there's some dispute about how far north they got. Some say they were as far north as Big Spring, and others say that no, they kind of stayed up, they went just a little north of the Rio Grande around Big Bend, and then they went back into, Chihuahua, what is now Chihuahua, and Sonora, and Sinaloa, and all these other places. There's still dispute about their actual route, but there is much fertile historical research, because the people who study it, it gives them a way to understand in their imaginations these intricate trading routes that existed, between all of these innumerable cultures and civilizations that we have no trace of except in the land itself and in the myth itself, and the ways that we might understand the myths of the ways that is related of what happened in that land. But evidently, it became like a system of almost like plunder and payment and restitution. So the 4 castaways, now shamans and healers, dressed in the clothes, the animal skins, and given these gifts of turquoise and other things, they would go to one village, and word of them would proceed, and they would be accompanied by those who had accompanied them from the previous village where they were. The people in the previous village, when they came to the new village, they would plunder and take the riches of this new village, and then they would go. And then the castaways would say, are you all right? The people that accompanied us have taken your food and your clothing and your riches. And they said, that's okay. Heal our sick, and we will accompany you to the next village. And this happened again and again. They would heal the sick, and they would get better. And then a contingent of the inhabitants of that place would accompany them to the next place, where I guess the message was, we bring you these 4 healers. Now, we will take your riches, we will leave them with you. They will heal your sick, and you will accompany them to the next place where you will be able to avail yourself of the riches that are there, as long as you leave the healers there, so that they will do their good. So you can see a strange and magical exchange of value was happening. And Cabeza de Vaca and Estebanico and Castillo and Dorantes, they could only see it and they could only play their part in it, but they also kind of knew that something else was happening. They would sometimes see an individual who would, okay, they would heal, and then they would get food in repayment, and then they would eat, and only when they were done eating would the ones who had accompanied them come to eat. It was their decorum. That was the way that they showed respect. But they would sometimes see that there was an individual in the shadows, kind of, who would kind of like facilitate that. So, and they would be guided along these routes and everything by word of mouth and the things that they heard. But surely there was some kind of administrative kind of guidance that was happening as they made their way across this landscape, which was otherwise unknown to them. But what was known to them was the energy that was coming out of them to do good, to ease the suffering of these strange peoples they had found themselves among in this strange land, in this extremity in which they were living. Altogether unlike any other story that you might hear. Certainly, we are in the land of myth, and yet this is how it is. Okay, let me just jump ahead for just a moment. When Cabeza de Vaca related this story after everything was all over and he made it back, he spoke to the king. Salutations of the king. This is where I want to bring in the whole aristocratic thing. Because let's consider really, there's something else that is going on now in this great and tragic history. And you can tell that the way that I want to understand it is to see this immense activity of human beings swept along by forces that they do not understand. And yet at the same time, something comes from within them as individuals that changes their whole understanding of their own individual experience. And so all they have left is not gold and not land and not conquest and not atrocity, but just the story itself of what happened. So that Cabeza de Vaca, in his literary work, in his story of this, the Relación, as it was called, he addressed it to the king. But sometimes when he was talking to the king, this is the aristocratic thing, you knew that he was speaking to an individual on the throne with administrative powers and political kind of powers. At the same time, he was addressing a personage who occupied a particular office, which had contact with realms that were not necessarily immediately available to the eye. And then other times when he addresses Your Majesty, you get this sense that he's talking even to something, a presence beyond even that. What enables him to tell this story of what had happened, knowing that the Inquisition is never where you expect it, and they're still very active, and he's talking about these mysterious things that he's doing, healing pagans, in and of itself, a pagan thing that he could be doing. It could be seen that way. People are punished severely for that kind of thing. It can happen. He had seen from his youth what the Inquisition could do. But at the same time, he speaks to the king. I'm sure Your Majesty will understand that I am relating the things that I saw. I am telling you what happened. This is what I did. He doesn't, it's very mythical in this way because he just gives us the story. And we are left, even now, to take it in and to try to understand it so that something on our tongues can be reborn and passed along as a way of understanding, because it is part of our cultural inheritance. And I would have to allow that somehow everything that I'm relating to you now thematically was a subject or a theme or a thought that crossed the lips of Cabeza de Vaca or Estebanico or Dorantes or Castillo as they were talking together and living this strange life among all of these strange people. And you know that it was part and parcel of their daily lives and their arduous circumstances that they would ask themselves, what's going on here? What's the real meaning of this? This is what we are doing. This is what we learned in the world that we came from. But this is what is happening now. What are we to make of this? And they were able to proceed, and they were able to live, and they were able to survive when so many did not. Just as we are able, because they survived, we are able to talk about this now. So it's a prodigy, isn't it? It's a marvel, isn't it? A puzzle and a perplexity, and troubling in so many ways, and enriching. Anyway, but here's what happened eventually. They kept on going west. They were actually on the downslope of the Sierra Madre. They came to a village. The people had shoes. They lived in clay huts with pillars, thick pillars. The women had cotton tunics that reached to their knees and skirts that reached to their feet and shoes of deerskin, was it? And such a established settlement was so amazing to them. And it was in a drier place, a higher kind of place, and they were able to heal a lot for some reason. It is said that as many sometimes as 1,000 to 3,000 people would accompany them by this time as they were making their way across the continent. But then their numbers would change. The other ones would go and then new ones would come. As I said, this movement of this population along this route seemingly had something else that was guiding it and directing it. Who knows, but it was some archaic kind of pilgrimage. Maybe they were just playing a part. Maybe someone had been doing that before. So many legends. So many legends right under their very feet. But anyway, in this place, as a reward, they got good food and everything, but they also got 600 dried out deer hearts connected by a thread. It was given to them. Imagine going into a village and healing people for reasons that you don't really know why, but there it is. And you're given a garland of dried deer hearts. What would you do? Well, you would name the place Corazon. They named the place Corazon because they received a gift of 600 desiccated deer hearts. And then they went on their way. It wasn't long, though. Sometime around Christmas time, 1536, Cabeza de Vaca saw something around the neck of one of the peoples who were accompanying them. It was a horseshoe nail. Now, between them, they knew 6 languages, but where they didn't necessarily weren't able to use them because there were hundreds of languages, but he was able to communicate and say, "Where did you get that? What is that?" And the person said, "Oh, this came from some people who came from the south who came to our village and took many of us and killed some of us, and we escaped. But I took this from one of their horses." And they looked at each other and they said, "Oh, we're near the land of the Christians. We're coming back to familiar territory." And so they knew that they had to find them. But they had lived among these people. They had been succored by them, abused by them, healed them. They themselves had succored. They themselves had abused. They were understanding things in a different way. And they knew that they had a basis for their vision that the soldiers of fortune did not. And Cabeza de Vaca, because he had that ideal, this is what I'm talking about. When I speak of the aristocratic ideal, that's kind of what I mean. It is not something that you can trace politically. If you do, you will distort it, as is often done. I'm talking about something that comes out unmediated from someone. There are so many ways that it is that way, and all of us understand it in some way. This mythos gives it to us a certain way. Anyway, by the time they made contact with this party of slavers who come up from Sinaloa, sent by one Guzman, a protege of Cortez, in turn, who jumped the gun on Cortez, just as Cortez had jumped the gun on Velasquez, and now was extending his megalomaniacal dream up into the north, into Culiacan and Sinaloa, and perhaps even hadn't heard anything about the Narvaez expedition, maybe wanted to get hold of that unclaimed land as well. And Guzman, among the conquistadors who do not have a good reputation, he had a bad reputation even for them. He was excommunicated by the Bishop of Mexico City for some of the things that he did. Atrocities. And yet, at the same time, he was very, very puritanical. There were no concubines or anything like that with him, but there was just mass enslavement and torture and atrocity. And, well, anyway, one of his lieutenants was leading a small party and were up in that way, and they're the ones who rendezvoused with these four, as well as the 1 to 2 to 3,000 Native Americans who were all around him. And they, of course, saw, this guy with a beard to his waist and hair to his waist, and a Moor, they always called Estebanico a Moor, and Castellano and Dorantes, who spoke to them in Spanish, and as Cabeza relates, they stood and looked at us a long time. But they made it known to them, who they were. And, of course, this party of this military party, they were there to get this, human cargo. And they saw all these people around them. And, of course, they were thinking, oh, here's just a whole lot of people. And then these guys are bringing them to us. Hey, is that what's happening here? Mm-hmm. And Cabeza de Vaca said, he relates that he said this to them, that night as they camped. Something to the effect of, you come to this territory looking for people to capture. They leave their villages, and the food that you also seek, corn and maize, so that you can live, you can't get it because the places where it used to grow under human cultivation, the ones who do that have fled because you are coming here to take them. So you go hungry, the land goes to waste. Now, said Cabeza de Vaca, we came from a land far beyond what you have ever seen, and we can tell you the truth. There is vast riches available to all. Food, ways of living, cultures. You seek gold. Well, they understand gold, and they like gold, but not the way that you do. But if you go into their world wanting what you want, they will leave, and you will not have the riches of the land that would have otherwise been available to you. Does it not make sense, then, for us to learn how to live in this land with all of us here, doing what we do to live from the land? He actually articulated this to a party of conquistadors. One of the conquistadors, the canny soldiers of fortune, manipulators of people, influencers, said to one of the Native Americans, do you realize that these four people whom you revere, these shamans or whatever, they come from the same land we do? And according to the story, that Native American said, no, they do not. They come from the sky. You come from the sky. Anyone who comes from where we don't know, we say they come from the sky. And other than that, though, you come from the place where the sun rises. They come from where the sun sets. They give life to those who are sick. You take away those who are living. They appreciate the gifts that we give them, which include these precious stones that so electrifies your desire, but they appreciate it in the same way that we do. For you, it is some mania. So they are not the same people as you are. This too was said. So, then and there, wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall and would have heard that? Well, but that's how it was. But anyway, in this way, long about 1536, they reconnected with the land that they had come from. And in this way, they actually did finally make it. I don't know if they ever made it to Panuco, which is Tampico now. They actually, ended up in Mexico City. And, I have to say, those thousands who accompanied Cabeza de Vaca and the others, they were effectively protected. They were not taken into captivity. Not only that, but because of what Cabeza de Vaca was, how he was presenting his message as he began, even from that moment, and as he continued to do, with all his powers of persuasion and all he had been educated to present himself as a noble, he was able to communicate to the nascent, empiristic royal structures. He was able to articulate to them this, vision of how things could be in the new world, and he was able to use that influence in a certain sense where, some of the atrocities were abated, for a while. But he did protect those who were with him. And I think that the record also says that the villages in the path, and also the villages that had been before marauded, they were repopulated again by the people who had once lived there. And so, you can say this is the practical fruit in terms of policy. Well, there's that. Anyway, well, let's check the watch now to make a long and intricate and fabulous story, of which I've given you just a little taste. Oh, I see that the time has done what time does. So it's now time for me to tell you a little bit of what happened. Eventually, Estebanico joined an expedition back into the north, looking for the 7 cities of Cibola. A lot of his story is legendary. But it is said by the Zunis that he perished by their hand because his demands for turquoise and other things were too exorbitant or something like that. He joined a kind of a party. Estebanico and Castillo, there were a lot of widows, rich widows in New Spain for various reasons, and they each married rich widows with vast land holdings. Cabeza de Vaca went back to Spain, and he related his story to King Charles, and then he came back to the New World, and he had in mind a more humane way of understanding things, which he did try to put into place. This was further down in South America near Asuncion and Paraguay and places like that, where he did certain things as he got this alcaledamente, or some kind of like principality, or some high official in the principalities, and he was able to make it so that the soldiers and the Native Americans would be encamped in different places, because evidently a lot of bad things might happen, that would cause conflict and everything. He made sure that all trade was done through certified agents of the crown. Certain really basic kind of policy decisions to make it so that there would be less exploitation, and which would have been effective, except that everybody else just said to him, this is not the way we do things here. You're not going to work out here. And eventually they blew the whistle on him, and he was sent back in chains back to Spain, where he faced the danger of imprisonment for various kind of administrative kind of malfeasances. But really because he was trying to establish a much more humane way, but that was costing people money. Doesn't it sound familiar? But at the same time, eventually he was able to clear his name, so that by the end of his life, he actually made it back to his home village, Heraz, in Andalusia, a place known for its sweet wines, so that we say Heraz, we say sherry now, because that's where that stuff comes from, the place where Cabeza de Vaca was born. But he went back to the place where he was born. And after some vicissitudes, he was released from prison. Like I say, he was sent back in chains, but he was released from prison. His whatever legal troubles he were in got cleared up in one way or another. He married Maria Marmola. I cannot remember how to pronounce her last name, but she was a converso. They were a Jewish family who had converted to Catholicism, but there was riches there too. So on one side, he had the nobility, but not much money. But on the other side, they had the money and some degree of aristocratic connection. But some of that fortune was used to make it so that he did not end up in the dungeon. But and he was able, actually, he did protect his family all the way on. There is a document that still exists, signed by him later on, 1550 something, where he is paying a ransom for a relative of his who has been taken prisoner by the King of Algiers. And so he's still working in that way. And so, I don't know. I just have to leave it off there because I know that the time has gone on here. But, so what this is, it's a myth. I have related to you a little of what happened and some of the implications. It is the story of an ideal that guides someone through all these vicissitudes in such a way that eventually all rational understanding goes out the window and all we are left with is the recollection of what happened, which I presented to you. I am grateful to all of those people for having survived and for thinking the thoughts that they have thought, because as mythical presences, what they give, their message, still resonates. Everything that they went through, everything that they did, and everything that it makes us consider. And this is the way inspiration travels down through the ages. This is the way knowledge is transmitted from generation unto generation through these strange tales. So I commend you to the research into these stories. It's all over the place. And you can learn in your own way with deep sincerity, humble regard, and understanding, which will come our way. Anyway, I thank you for your heroic listening. And it is time to proceed with our lives. All right, so long for now.